It was early January, and I had decided to spend a few days at my family's old cabin in the mountains of Montana. The cabin wasn't anything fancy, just a modest, rustic lodge that my grandparents had built back in the 1960s. It sat on a secluded piece of land, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense woods and snow-covered peaks. My family used it as a quiet retreat, a place to escape the noise of everyday life. This time, it was my turn to enjoy it. I'd planned to stay for 3 nights, just long enough to recharge and soak in the peacefulness of the wilderness. The journey to the cabin was an adventure in itself. I parked my truck at the edge of a remote Forest Service road and unloaded my snowmobile. From there, it was a 5-mile ride through snowdrifts and frozen trees to reach the cabin. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the hum of the snowmobile and the occasional crunch of snow underfoot. When I finally arrived, I felt a wave of relief. The cabin looked just as I remembered it. Small, sturdy, and welcoming, with a thin layer of snow covering the roof and a plume of smoke curling from the chimney, courtesy of the automatic heater my dad had installed a few years back. I stepped inside, greeted by the familiar scent of pine wood and the faint mustiness of a place that hadn't been used in a while. The interior was cozy, with a wood stove in the corner, a small kitchenette, and a bedroom just big enough for a twin bed and a dresser. I unpacked my things, started a fire in the wood stove, and settled in. Within half an hour, I could feel the stress of the outside world melting away. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and no distractions. Just the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling in the cold. The first night was perfect. I made a simple dinner on the wood stove, read a book by the fire, and went to bed early, lulled to sleep by the silence of the wilderness. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft pink glow over the snow outside. I made coffee and breakfast, savoring the quiet and the slow pace of life out here. After eating, I bundled up in my winter gear, thick boots, a heavy jacket, and gloves, and stepped outside to gather more firewood from the shed. That's when I saw them, footprints, fresh ones, leading right up to the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. I froze in place, staring at the tracks. They were unmistakable. Boot prints, clearly defined in the snow, coming from the direction of the woods and stopping just a few feet from the front door. I glanced around, my breath visible in the cold air, but there was no one in sight. The woods were silent, the only sound the faint rustle of wind through the trees. I knelt down to examine the prints more closely. They were large, probably from a man's boots, and they looked recent. The edges were sharp, not yet softened by wind or new snowfall. Whoever had made them had been here recently, likely during the night. A chill ran down my spine. Why would someone be out here, in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of winter? And why had they come to the cabin? I followed the footprints for a short distance, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The tracks led straight into the woods, with no indication of heading toward the road. That was the strangest part. The nearest road was miles away, and there were no other cabins or properties nearby. If someone had come out here, they would have needed a snowmobile or some other way to travel through the deep snow. But there were no tracks from a vehicle, just these lone footprints, disappearing into the trees. I felt a mix of confusion and unease. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave right then, but another part reasoned that if whoever it was had come by and hadn't done anything, maybe it was just a harmless mistake. Maybe a hunter or a hiker had gotten lost and stumbled upon the cabin. Still, the thought of someone lurking outside while I slept made my skin crawl. I grabbed an armful of firewood from the shed and hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. For the next few hours, I sat by the fire, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see a figure standing in the snow. But there was nothing, just the endless expanse of white and the dark line of trees in the distance. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. I thought it might help to follow the footprints and see where they led. Maybe I'd find another cabin or some sign of life that would explain their presence. I bundled up again, grabbed a walking stick for stability, and set off into the woods. The trail of footprints was easy to follow. They cut a straight path through the trees, weaving around snow-covered boulders and fallen branches. I walked for about 20 minutes, my boots crunching in the snow, my breath coming in short puffs. The woods were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. I kept my eyes on the ground, following the tracks, but my mind was racing. What if I ran into whoever had made them? What would I say? What would they want? Then, suddenly I heard it, a sharp, unmistakable crunch in the snow ahead of me. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding. The sound had come from just a few yards away, somewhere among the trees. I whipped my head up, scanning the area, but there was no one in sight. Everything was still, the woods silent once more. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone out there?" No response, not a sound. The tension was unbearable. My mind raced with possibilities. Was someone watching me? Hiding behind a tree? Or was it just an animal, a deer or a fox, moving through the snow? But deep down, I knew it wasn't an animal. The sound had been too deliberate, too human. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my eyes darting from tree to tree, my body tense with fear. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned around and started walking back toward the cabin, trying to keep my pace steady. But with every step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I glanced over my shoulder several times, half expecting to see someone following me, but the woods remained empty. When I finally reached the cabin, I hurried inside and locked the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I packed up my things, throwing everything into my backpack as quickly as I could. I didn't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I loaded my gear onto the snowmobile, started the engine, and took off down the trail, the cold wind biting at my face. I haven't been back to the cabin since that day. I don't know who made those footprints or why they were out there, but I'm certain it wasn't an accident. The thought of someone lurking in the woods, watching me, still gives me chills. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I think about that cabin and wonder if I'll ever have the courage to go back. But for now, it remains a mystery, one I'm not sure I want to solve. Every year, toward the end of February, my best friend Ryan and I make it a tradition to go on a winter camping trip. We've been doing it for years, ever since we were teenagers. Now in our late 20s, we've backpacked and camped in all sorts of places, from the deserts of Arizona to the forests of the Pacific Northwest. But there's something uniquely magical about camping in the snow-covered woods of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. It's quiet, serene, and with the right gear, it's not as dangerous as people might think. This year, we chose a spot deep in the San Juan National Forest, a place we'd been to once before. It was remote, peaceful, and exactly what we needed to escape the chaos of everyday life. We arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon, loaded our backpacks with supplies, and hiked about 2 miles into the woods. The snow was deep and the air was crisp, but the scenery was breathtaking. Towering pines heavy with snow framed the trail, and the only sounds were the crunch of our boots and the occasional chirp of a winter bird. When we reached our campsite, a small clearing surrounded by trees, we got to work setting up our tents and gathering firewood. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, we had a roaring fire going and were sitting in folding camp chairs, sipping hot cocoa spiked with a little whiskey to take the edge off the cold. The first few hours were perfect. We talked, laughed, and reminisced about past trips, the fire casting flickering shadows on the snow around us. But then, just as the last light of day faded, we heard it, a sound that made both of us freeze mid-conversation. It was a scream, distant but unmistakable, echoing through the forest. It wasn't the kind of scream you'd expect from an animal. It was human, raw, and filled with something between pain and terror. It lasted only a few seconds before the woods fell silent again. Ryan and I exchanged wide-eyed looks. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice low. "I don't know," I replied, my heart racing. But it didn't sound good. We stood up, scanning the trees in the direction the sound had come from. It was too dark to see much, and the scream had been too far away to pinpoint its source. Ryan tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a mountain lion or something. They can sound pretty freaky. I wasn't convinced. That didn't sound like any animal I've ever heard. We debated what to do, but ultimately decided to stay put. It was too late to hike out, and besides, we had no idea where the sound had come from. We added more wood to the fire and kept our voices low, the earlier ease of the evening replaced by a tense unease. Hours passed, and we didn't hear anything else. Eventually, we convinced ourselves it was nothing and turned in for the night. The next morning, we woke up to a world blanketed in fresh snow. The sun was shining, and the forest looked like something out of a postcard. We made breakfast over the fire, bacon and eggs cooked on a portable stove, and tried to shake off the lingering unease from the night before. But just as we were finishing up, we heard it again. This time, the scream was closer, much closer. It sounded like it was coming from no more than 200 feet away. Ryan and I looked at each other, our earlier calm shattered. "We need to check it out," he said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying his fear. I nodded, though every instinct told me to stay put. I grabbed my hunting knife from my pack, and Ryan picked up a heavy walking stick. We bundled up in our winter gear and headed into the woods, following the direction of the scream. The snow was deep, and the going was slow, but we moved as quietly as we could, our breath visible in the cold air. About 150 feet into the trees, we heard it again. This time, it was so close it made my skin crawl. We stopped in our tracks, scanning the area. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy and oppressive. I glanced at Ryan, and he gave me a grim nod. We kept moving, step by cautious step, until Ryan suddenly froze. He held up a hand, signaling me to stop, and pointed ahead. My stomach dropped. Lying in the snow was the carcass of a deer, its body partially covered in fresh snow. It hadn't been there long. The blood staining the snow around it was still bright red. My mind raced. Had a predator done this? A mountain lion or a wolf? But the way the deer was positioned didn't look natural. It looked like it had been dragged. Before I could say anything, Ryan tapped my shoulder and pointed again. My eyes followed his gesture, and that's when I saw him. About 50 feet away, standing between two trees, was a man. He was tall and thin, wearing nothing but a tattered flannel shirt and jeans, despite the freezing temperatures. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were fixed on us with an intensity that made my blood run cold. For a moment, none of us moved. The man just stood there, staring as if he were studying us. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the trees. Ryan and I didn't need to discuss what to do next. We turned and hurried back to camp, our hearts pounding. We packed up our gear as quickly as we could, not even bothering to take down the tents properly. The whole time I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man watching us from the trees. But the forest remained still and silent. We hiked out in record time, the weight of what we'd seen pressing down on us. Neither of us spoke much on the drive home, but the question hung in the air between us. Who was that man? What was he doing out there in the middle of nowhere in the dead of winter, with no proper gear? And why had he been watching us? We haven't been back to that campsite since. In fact, we've avoided the San Juan National Forest altogether. Sometimes late at night, I think about that man and wonder if he was real or if the cold and the isolation played tricks on our minds. But deep down, I know what I saw, and I know I never want to see it again. New Year's Eve has never really been my thing. I'm not much of a party person, but every year, without fail, my friends manage to drag me out to some event or another. This year, my buddy Jake was hosting a party at his place. Jake was the kind of guy who always went all out. He had a huge house on the outskirts of town, complete with a sprawling backyard and enough space to host half the neighborhood. It was the kind of place where you could lose yourself in the crowd, which was both a blessing and a curse. My friend Chris picked me up around 9:30 p.m., and we made the 20-minute drive to Jake's place. The party was already in full swing when we arrived. There were about 30 or 40 people there, most of whom I recognized from previous gatherings. The music was loud, the drinks were flowing, and the energy was infectious. Against my better judgment, I found myself joining in on the drinking games and toasting to the new year as the ball dropped on TV. By 2 a.m., I was feeling the effects of one too many beers, and I knew it was time to call it a night. The problem was, Chris was in no condition to drive. I found him passed out on the couch in the living room, snoring loudly. I scanned the room for anyone else who might be sober enough to give me a ride. But it was clear that wasn't going to happen. Reluctantly, I pulled out my phone and ordered an Uber. The app said my driver was 10 minutes away, so I grabbed my coat and headed outside to wait. Jake's house was located at the end of a long, quiet street, surrounded by woods on 3 sides. It was peaceful out there, especially at night. The air was crisp, and the only sound was the faint hum of the party inside. I sat down on the curb at the end of the driveway, wrapping my coat tightly around myself to ward off the cold. I figured I'd just close my eyes for a minute while I waited. What felt like only a few minutes later, I heard the sound of a car pulling up. I opened my eyes to see a black sedan idling at the end of the driveway. The driver rolled down the window and called out, "Uber for Alex?" "Yeah, that's me," I said, standing up and brushing the snow off my jeans. I was still a little out of it, so I didn't think twice about getting into the car. The driver was a man in his late 40s or early 50s, with short, graying hair and a thick beard. He gave me a quick nod as I climbed into the back seat. "Big night?" he asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "Yeah, something like that," I replied, not really in the mood for small talk. I leaned my head against the window and closed my eyes, hoping to doze off for the rest of the ride. But something about the driver made me uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was something off about the way he kept looking at me in the mirror. I told myself I was just being paranoid. After all, I'd had a lot to drink, and my judgment wasn't exactly at its best. A minute or so into the drive, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. My stomach dropped when I saw the notification. It was a message from the Uber app. "Your driver has arrived," it read. Below that was a text from the actual driver. "I'm here. Where are you?" My heart started racing. I looked up and caught the driver's eyes in the mirror. He was staring right at me, his expression unreadable. I quickly looked away, trying to act casual, but my mind was spinning. This wasn't my Uber driver. I had no idea who this man was or where he was taking me. I glanced out the window, trying to get my bearings. We were on a road I didn't recognize, heading away from town and deeper into the woods. Panic set in as I realized how vulnerable I was. I was alone in a car with a stranger, and no one knew where I was. I knew I had to get out of there. As the car slowed down at a red light, I made my move. I grabbed the door handle, flung it open, and jumped out of the car. The driver shouted something, but I didn't stick around to hear it. I hit the pavement hard, scraping my hands and knees, but I didn't care. I scrambled to my feet and took off running, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station about half a mile down the road. My hands were shaking as I called a real Uber, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the black sedan pulling into the parking lot. But it never came. I still don't know who that man was or what his intentions were. Maybe he was just some guy trying to make a quick buck by pretending to be an Uber driver, or maybe he had something far more sinister in mind. Either way, I can't help but think about how differently that night could have ended. I was lucky to get away when I did, but it's a mistake I'll never make again. From now on, I'll always double-check the license plate and make sure the driver matches the photo in the app. Because you never really know who's behind the wheel.